Tasting Freedom, a book by two journalists, Daniel R. Biddle and Murray Dubin. It's about Octavius Catto, some say Catto, who was a 19th century Renaissance man, educator, civil rights, human rights advocate. And you're going to hear their talk on the book.
Send him an email and beg him for his phone number. By the next night, these two total strangers are having a lively conversation. Leonard, at the time, was in his early 60s. And I told him what Murray and I were up to, that we thought there was at least a long piece of writing, if not a book, in the life of this ancestor of his family, Octavius Catto. And we only knew a tiny bit at the time, and Leonard, bless his heart, began to share with me kind of the family lore, what little he knew about Octavius Catto. And he said how he and his wife Maxine had trekked around, had come up to Philadelphia trying to find Catto's gravesite without success. And he said that he too was fascinated with this one life of this one ancestor and didn't know much yet. He was looking for more. And he said one reason for his fascination, I'll never forget this, he was fortunate enough that his grandmother had lived into her late 90s and had only passed recently. At that time, Leonard said in that first conversation how whenever the name Rosa Parks came up in the news, his grandmother would say to him sort of mysteriously, you know, Rosa Parks sat down, but she was not the first one to sit down. Your great-great-uncle sat down. And Leonard shared the sense that he didn't really know what she was talking about. He knew that Octavius Catto had had some heroic role in an earlier phase of the civil rights struggle, but he didn't know very much, and he wanted to find out more. At the end of that conversation, he says, look, I'll help you guys any way I can. I too am obsessed with finding out more about Catto. All I ask is that you have Denzel play him in the movie. Well, you know, that was many years ago when Denzel Washington was young enough to play this guy in the movie. We thought this project might take us a year, and we thought of it as a biography, the story of this one remarkable man. But something else that Leonard said to us the first time we sat down and had lunch with him down in Virginia grew and grew on us, because after telling us what he knew and pointing us to various relatives that he thought could help us out, and kind of sharing with us things that his grandmother had told him, he says, don't overestimate this one guy. You have to understand there were 100 O.V. Cattos. Well, we thought that was just Leonard being humble because it was his own family, his own ancestor that he was referring to. The truth of those words grew and grew on us all through our research. And we came to realize that what he meant was that there's no understanding of this one man without learning about, as we had to do, because it wasn't taught to us in high school or college. I mean, I was a history major at the University of Michigan, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't know anything about this side of American history. That Catto was one man in a movement of civil rights and anti-slavery activists that included hundreds and thousands of men and women, young and old, some of them quite young, and much like the better-known modern civil rights struggle, those men and women fought for the right to access to public transportation, access to the schoolhouse, access to big league baseball, access to the ballot box. And they fought those battles, you know, in a very different time, but like that modern civil rights struggle, They quite often came back from their meetings or their marches with their heads bloodied, or their bones broken, or their churches burned, or their schools destroyed. And yet, like the heroes of the modern civil rights struggle, they went back for more. In our research, we learned how, they lost many of those battles in the 1840s and 50s and 60s and 70s, but they won some of them. And yet, the stories of their defeats and their victories are not known to most modern Americans. And the point of this little book here, all 400 and some pages of it, is to change that.
You're going to continue talking because you're doing better than I expected.
A little more sales now?
Oh,
We've never done this before. Just kidding. Want me to do more sales? More sales? Should I tell jokes while you get ready to It's early. It might be around page 70 or 80. Please.
I grew up in East Lombard.
okay.
And when I hear you talking about walking Lombard to South, and in my mind I'm going, well, wait a minute, I was there, I remember all that. And what amazes me, but I kind of knew Du Bois and some other historical figures came out of that area.
Yes.
But I guess my question was this, was that a hub for African Americans?
That's exactly what it was.
Because people ask me where I grew up, and I tell them, Ethan Lombard, I said there were Jewish people on this side and Italian, and then it was 5 blocks of blacks. That's all, So what was that we were all focused in that area?
Well, it's a great question. I think what we learned from our research was that part of Philadelphia, at least in the middle of the 19th century and really reaching back to the early 19th century, was the hub not only of black Philadelphia, and it changed later. I think around the turn of the century, lots of Jewish and Italian families moved into that neighborhood. But Civil War time, it was the hub not only of black Philadelphia, but really of free people of color all over the North. It was, as Murray found out in the research, there was a higher percentage of African American citizens in Philadelphia than in any other city in the North at that time. And that changed over time, but something that fascinated us was how, great, better-known leaders like Frederick Douglass came to Philadelphia then quite often because it really was the political and intellectual and religious hub. What with churches like the AME and the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas getting their starts here as long ago as 1795, 1800.
Yeah, I got it.
It's a great question, though. And that really was the center of all kinds of interesting activities: schools, churches, political groups, literary clubs.
Thank you for asking that. You saved me.
Another question. I have a question.
Yes.
Did you give us the time frame that Catto was lived?
I forgot to read the title of the preface. That scene Murray read was in 1871. At that point, Catto was 32.
And we'll tell you more about what happens to him. Okay? But he's 32 and he's born in 1839 in South Carolina. So, in the mid-19th century, there's a civil rights movement among free African Americans in the North. And among the things they're doing is traveling. Now, there are no cars, there's no SEPTA. They're taking trains and carriages, and they're traveling to other states and in their states to try to gather support for slavery to end and gather support for more rights for free blacks in the North who, in the 1840s, can't vote. And so they really don't have all that many rights. They can't sit on juries, and they're barred from many public institutions. They can't go to the Academy Museum. They can't go to the Franklin Institute. Among those leaders who are traveling and talking civil rights are a man from Pittsburgh named Martin Delaney and a man from Ohio named Charles H. Langston. These are both important figures in the history of civil rights in America who aren't well known enough. Okay. Martin Delaney and his Ohio contact, the light-skinned Negro abolitionist Charles H. Langston, were riding north from a meeting in Columbus, Ohio, and stopped at the hotel of a sympathizer in Marseilles, which is spelled like Marseille in France, but pronounced in Ohio like Marseilles. The sun was setting and townspeople were pitching quoits in the main street. When they saw the two Negroes climbing from a carriage, the game came to a halt. In the hotel, local men buttonholed the visitors and proposed an impromptu anti-slavery meeting at the schoolhouse. Would Delaney and Langston agree to address the meeting? They could not say no. They washed up and started walking toward the schoolhouse. As Delaney and Langston walked, white men and boys, and Delaney's words fell in close to our heels and followed them into the schoolhouse. Sensing a trap, they declined to speak. The man who had invited them shouted, "I move we adjourn and consider this a darky burlesque." A cry went up, "Darky burlesque!" and the swelling, almost festive crowd followed them to the hotel. Delaney and Langston watched from a window as whites lit a barrel of tar and shouted, "Rush in and take them! Kill the Negroes!" Delaney could hear 1,000 demonic howls along with talk of taking him and Langston south to sell them. A blacksmith forged handcuffs. Boys blew horns and banged tambourines as the fire lit the night. Delaney secured a butcher knife and vowed not to be taken alive. The innkeeper and a one-armed Mexican war veteran tried to calm people down. "Did you hear how those black fellows talk?" the veteran said. "These are educated Negroes." In time, the crowd's energy ebbed, and at dawn, the Negroes sprinted out. They reached their carriage amid a barrage of stones and shouted promises of death if they ever returned. Thus did a group of white citizens nearly cut short Martin Delaney's career as a doctor, orator, journalist, novelist, African explorer, and soldier, and nearly deprived the world of the poetry of Langston's future grandson, who went by the name of Langston Hughes.
That story is one of many that people on the front lines of that struggle turned into political ammunition. That was something that struck us all through the research, that as tough as the odds were for people in that struggle, they found a way to treat every act of persecution as fresh ammunition. Once we got to give a reading down at Mother Bethel AME at 6th and Lombard, the church, which you know has a tremendous history, and the pastor there, Reverend Mark Kelly Tyler, the sermon that he preached that day, the day that we got to read to an audience there, was based around these words: make persecution your friend. And those words really rang true to us from all we had learned about that earlier generation. Over and over again, the worst things that befell them for sticking their necks out, you know, politically, they would turn into fresh evidence, sort of a fresh exhibit in the argument for equal rights. And we always have fun thinking about the parallels between that struggle back then and what's going on right now, because obviously the country has made all kinds of progress in terms of equal rights in the 150 years between then and now. But let's think for a minute about what's been in the news this year, and I'm going to think for a minute about the immigration ban that President Trump has tried to impose, where people from 6 different, mostly Muslim countries are all but barred from coming into this country. And I want to think about this thing of turning persecution into an ally. What do we see on TV after that ban was imposed? Scenes at airports all over this country where crowds of people who maybe hadn't cared very much about immigration issues or about fellow citizens of the world who came from other countries were forming up protest groups at airports to try to help people get into the country. And a thing that struck me was how that law, or that attempt at a new law, caused, I think, lots of Americans who maybe hadn't cared about that issue as much before. Suddenly all these people from strange-sounding countries weren't just people with strange-sounding names like Muhammad or Aziz, or women wearing hijabs, but became real people. Sons and daughters, parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, who were being pulled apart by federal officials. I think therein began to change a little bit of that argument. It was, you could hope that maybe that whole policy began to backfire, and therein we saw a parallel to what Delaney and these other people in this early civil rights struggle encountered in the year 1850. In 1850 is one of the many compromises that the federal government struck to sort of put off confronting the issue of slavery by way of turning some of the new western states into free states, like California, states where slavery wasn't allowed. A big act of compromise to sort of buy off the support of powerful politicians in the South, the political bloc that abolitionists used to call the slave power. A law was enacted in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. And the idea was it would empower Southern slaveholders to treat federal marshals and citizens all over the North as their helpers anytime they decided that someone had run from slavery. And all a slaveholder had to do was swear out a warrant, just that one person's signature in the hands of a federal marshal in the North meant that the marshal could walk into any community and try to round up that person. And it did one other thing. It required that if you were a healthy white man in that community, and those marshals were trying to pick up a man or woman or child of color, and the person they were after resisted, white people in the neighborhood had to help out. They had to help pin that man down and handcuff him and restrain him. A lot of white Northerners who maybe hadn't cared one way or the other about this seemingly distant issue of slavery were made to understand that slavery, as one great historian, Eric Foner, likes to put it, that slavery wasn't just the South, slavery was national. And suddenly all these white citizens who maybe hadn't cared much and maybe had thought of slaves or people connected with slavery as a distant thing they never had to worry about, suddenly federal law was telling them that if those marshals came with a warrant for a man or woman or child, those white people had to take sides. And by the 1850s, there were lots of free people of color living in the North, and they had white friends. They worked for white employers. They were good neighbors. And suddenly this law said that if you were a white person and you knew that person, you had to treat that person as a runaway and help those marshals pin him down and maybe send him back. It was bad in other ways too. It really tipped the scales against anyone who was the subject of a warrant like that. If you got grabbed by those marshals and taken in front of a commissioner in a city like Philadelphia or New York or Pittsburgh or wherever, you didn't get a trial by jury, least of all a jury of your peers. You went before a specially appointed federal slave commissioner. And those commissioners were appointed by the president, and all they had to do all day was decide whether that fugitive was indeed the person that the marshals were looking for, and whether that man or woman or child had to be sent back to the South in chains. And as the anti-slavery forces like to point out back then, the law said that that commissioner would get paid $5 if he decided to set the person free, and $10 if he decided to send him south. And the rationale was that if you decided to send a person south, a lot more bureaucracy and paperwork was involved. But to everybody on the anti-slavery side, there was no doubt that the deck was stacked. And one thing this law did, I mean, it sort of put a target on the back of every free person of color in the North. And tens of thousands of people moved to Canada as a result. And that's a thing that, you know, another thing we really didn't get taught in school, that I think what we were told was that the North was free territory and the South had slavery. But in fact, for free people of color, the only real safe place to go was to get out of the country or to get up to Canada. And the other effect, I think maybe a little bit like this recent immigration ban, was that as odious as that was, that Fugitive Slave Act, it became ammunition in the hands of the anti-slavery and equal rights forces. It was another form of persecution that people turned into an ally, and it caused lots of people who maybe hadn't been awakened to the whole evil of slavery, it forced them to wake up to it.
There likely was a plan if he had been found guilty and returned, that people would have tried to kidnap him and get him away from marshals. Purvis is one of the few rich African Americans at that time. And they're also on the same side. I don't know if they ever had any interaction.
Purvis and Catto?
Yeah. I mean, Purvis would have been more a contemporary of Catto's father.
Yeah. I mean, they sort of give speeches saluting each other at various, victory meetings.
Yes.
They win the streetcar fight.
That's right.
They win voting rights. There's a
Yes.
great scene in 1870, long voting rights march.
But it was them as a Catto, former education writer for the Inquirer.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just asking, isn't there, after quite a long haul or a long effort, a curriculum that the school district may or may not start using?
Yeah, there is a free curriculum guide